Good afternoon, everyone. If you couldn't tell by my hipster glasses or the skinny black jeans, I'm a designer, so I'm a little out of place at a developer event, but thank you for having me. My name is Kunal Patel. I am a senior interaction designer on the material design team in San Francisco. So I work a lot on navigation, accessible design, and doing outreach like this. I love meeting members of the community, learning about what you all are making and how material design and myself can help you in doing that. I'll be around for office hours after this talk. If you have questions, please come find me there or at another time during the day. Today I'd like to tell you about some of the big updates to material design that we announced at Google I/O 2018, just this past May. And share some examples that will hopefully inspire you as you think about creating your own applications using material design. So hopefully if you're in this talk, you are somewhat familiar with material design, but if you're not, material design is a design system that Google introduced back in 2014. It's a design system that's bold, beautiful, and helps you create really easy, usable, and consistent applications. The underlying principle for material design is this idea of magic paper. You know, the surfaces of your application can grow and shrink. They can rise and fall as they need to and respond to user input in a very delightful and consistent way. And I think part of what's helped material design succeed in the time that it was announced, and one of the strengths of it as a design system, is that it's not just a set of components. We like to think about material design as a system of systems. We have a lot of guidance on our website and enforced in our components that talks about the layering of elements in your app, how they should be laid out, what effective navigation looks like, what is appropriate use of color, how can you use it to add emphasis to your application, what is a good type scale to use in your app, how do you incorporate motion or shape or iconography. One example of this that I'll quickly talk about is elevation. So elevation is material design's way of talking about how UI in your application gets layered, or how it should stack on top of each other. And taking this idea of magic paper and thinking about it layered, the closer it gets to the user, the farther it's getting from the screen, and the larger of a shadow that it casts. So taking that sort of conceptual idea of this idea of a light source and this paper that can rise or fall in your app, we applied that to UI. You know, we have these levels of shadows that we created based on our studies of real lighting rigs with paper and the shadows that were cast to make this visual design decision have some meaning in your app. And when you see that applied to UI, you know, you can see how this idea of a system behind the component becomes really valuable. You can think about what are the parts of my application that need to stay on screen, what moves beneath what, and what levels do they live at. So the shadows now become a meaningful part of your design rather than just a decoration. So in the time that we've launched material design, we've seen millions of apps using it on Android, iOS, and the web. If you are a developer, designer, product manager that's used material design in your application, thank you. It's always exciting to see what the community comes up with. And you know, I personally have responded to a lot of questions and try to do events like these to learn more about what are the needs of the community. And at I/O this year, we wanted to address a big need from the community that we'd heard consistently since launching material design. And that was that it was not flexible enough from a visual standpoint. People who were using our components and our patterns felt like their apps all looked the same, that it was hard to stand out. And we wanted to address this in a meaningful way. You know, we wanted to remain true to the principles that make material design so successful and usable for users, but open it up for you to be able to express your brand in very functional and aesthetically pleasing ways. What if you could use material design but still really show the impact of your brand and make it feel like your app and not an app that's a material design app? That was a question we were trying to answer. And the way we have done so is through a new capability for material design called material theming. Taking the same components and the same systems like elevation that I talked about earlier and opening them up for more expression in a structured way. How do you take the same set of useful underlying components and through adjustments to color, to shape, to typography, make them feel like your own? When we announced material theming at I/O, we also released a plugin for a design application called Sketch to help people like yourself start playing around with some of these ideas. Take a material design sticker sheet, change shape, change color, change typography, and quickly get your own branded sticker sheet that you could start playing around with and customizing. More information about the theme editor plugin is on our website under material.io/tools. So please take a look there if you're interested. So if you saw the news at I/O, or from my brief introduction here, you may be wondering how material theming really looks and feels in an application. How does it work? And with so much room for expression now opened up in material design, you may be wondering how to get started. If you're picking up material design, do you need to make sure you're changing every single color or adding your own typefaces or changing the shape of every single component? You know, what are some good ways to get started? So I'd like to use the rest of my time to share some examples of how we got started and how we tested these new theming capabilities to give you some inspiration there. Talk about how, as Google, we have applied material design to our own applications, and then leave you with some examples from the community on how to get started. So when we were originally designing material, we created our own set of fake applications to test it against. It was a wide range of all different kinds of functions and features to help stress test our ideas. And we included examples of these in our guidelines. And while we intended for these to just be a baseline, a starting point, we saw that many users who were reading our guidelines wound up adopting these very literally. You know, they took what they were seeing and they were applying them. So we wanted to make sure that when we were thinking about what the next wave of material design looked like, we expanded the range of examples we were presenting in our guidelines and to users to help you understand that there's a wider range of possibility available. You don't have to do exactly what you're seeing in our examples. What we wound up with was a set of 8 sample applications that we call the material studies, covering a range of industries, users, feature types, to help show off all of the new theming capabilities and new components that we've introduced. I'd like to tell you about 2 of those studies to show how even using some of the same components and ideas can yield very different outcomes in the look and feel and user experience of the app. One thing to note as well is that when material design started, it was very mobile focused. It was a mobile first design system, which was very new at the time. And we wanted to make sure in these studies that we went wider, that we showed these applications on tablet, on desktop, on larger screen sizes, and tested our components against them too, to make sure that the ideas stuck. What we wound up with was using a same unified set of components across these applications and testing the parameters to make sure that we could express the brands that we came up with in really clear, distinct ways. So the first material study that I want to talk about is Shrine, which is our e-commerce application. It's intended to be branded towards a younger, like millennial audience. and it has a few number of items. So it has, you can see it has this sort of muted pink color palette, a lot of use of white space, and it has this sort of geometric look to it. I want to break down some of those design choices that we made here. So the sort of geometric cuts that you're seeing, these sharp corners on buttons, on text fields, on that large sheet that you see in the bottom right there, was inspired by Shrine's logo, this diamond shape. Shrine also uses one of our new components called the backdrop, which presents an interaction model for your application that consists of a front layer and a back layer. So as content lives on your front layer, it can slide up or down to reveal more content or features on this back surface. We like to show a variety of use cases there. Shrine is using this back layer of the backdrop component for its navigation menu instead of a navigation drawer. Shrine also uses our image list component to present its items. In the past, we had one kind of standard grid layout that we showed for this component, but we've opened it up to have 4 different layouts now that you can read about in our article. And Shrine uses our woven layout type, which is a bit asymmetrical. It's a little bit quirky. It fits the brand of Shrine very well. Another one of our material studies that uses some of the same components is Crane. So Crane is a travel app. It's very rich in features. You can book flights, place to stay, dining reservations. It has a much bolder, saturated color palette that really emphasizes some of its UI. It's got a much denser UI need. It's displaying a lot of travel results, so it can't rely so much on white space as Shrine could. And the shapes are a lot rounded and friendlier here. So Crane uses that same backdrop component, but instead of using it for something simple like a list of navigation items, it's using that same surface for much more complicated and intense user flows, such as selecting dates for travel. You can see how even the same container can be used for very different outcomes. Crane also uses our image list, but with a different layout type than Shrine did. As I said before, for a travel application, density becomes a lot more important. You want to find that balance of showing users as many results as possible while still looking and feeling great. And so Crane uses the masonry layout of our image list component to strike that balance. A lot more information about the material studies and why we made the design decisions we did can be found on our website. If you go to material.io/design, you'll see a section called Material Studies that goes into each one of these in a little more detail. So hopefully what these examples of Shrine and Crane start to illustrate is that even with the same set of components, by thinking about how you're applying color, typography, shape, what variants of components you're using, you can end up with some really different outcomes that really match your use case, both as a brand and for your users. So the studies really show what material design looks like for a single application and what material theming looks like, for one app at a time. But what if you're a larger brand? What if you have several apps that all need to fit under one material theme? You may be worried that they all look the same. And this was a problem that we were worried about as Google. When we were thinking about how to develop Google's own material theme, we had to ask ourselves this question. We were building from the same sticker sheet that all of you are going to be building from. And we wanted to make sure that there was enough flexibility in how we presented the components and what were the guidelines, the systems around those components to allow apps within a single brand to be able to express themselves and meet the needs of their users. So I want to give you a little bit of the background into Google's material theme and show you two of our applications that launched with this theming to show you how they use the same baseline theme, but feel very different from one another. So Google's material theme was inspired by our search page. It is kind of classic Google. It's what users associate with us. So we wanted to start there too. And yes, there's our four-color logo for sure, but there's lots of other things going on here that we took cues from. You can notice the large amount of white space, this centered layout, the reduced elevation. There's not many things that are floating on this page. And so we took those principles, those underlying ideas, and applied them to our whole design system, to how we thought about designing Google's material theme. And I want to show you in two applications how that actually looks. The first app that I want to talk about is Google News. So this was announced back at I/O as well, and builds on Google's advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning to curate the news personally for you and bring together all the best information about a story for your needs. And where we can start is where we started with search. Google News' logo is centered. They wanted to have a lot of white space in their app, even though they have a lot of content. Find that balance. And you can see how that plays out. They've got the centered logo. There's not a lot of elevation here. They're relying on white space instead to kind of separate stories or bits of content. And you can see how that starts to happen in denser UI. And this is the full coverage feature that gathers information from around the web about a single story and collects it for you in one place. And a lot of how this section of the app is creating separation is through the use of white space. Google News also takes the colors of our logo and applies them to specific icons to create branded actions for us. So thinking about how your brand extends to your iconography can be a really powerful way to express your brand in the design system. So the floating action button on the left or the full coverage text button on the right with the icon really help these actions stand out as being from Google. Google News as a news application also relies a lot on typography and uses a typeface that we created based on our logo called Google Sans that's used in all of our products. Typography becomes really important, especially in such a content-heavy application, to help the brands come through. Using Google Sans helps the application feel like it's from Google, even if there's not a lot of color or a lot of UI on the screen that would otherwise help indicate where it's from. Another app that we announced at I/O that also uses Google's material theme, but in very different ways, is the Google Pay app. They started from the same place, having this centered, shortened logo to preserve as much white space as possible. You can see that their use of white space is very different here. Google Pay has a lot more informational or educational content that it needs to walk users through. It uses this white space to really focus a user on what the key content is on the screen and allows images to kind of bleed without a border. It's also much more task-oriented than Google News is. Users want to accomplish a task very quickly with Pay. They want to either complete a payment, add new payment types, load up passes that they may have. So instead of using that branded four-color icons for their actions, Google Pay goes with a bolder color choice. It uses our Google Blue to really help this new version of our floating action button component called the extended floating action button to really stand out and be in a really easy to reach location at the center of the bottom of the screen. Google Pay also relies a lot on motion design and animation to educate users. This is something that wouldn't work as well in a news application where there's a lot of content and everything moving may get really busy. But in an app like Pay, where you're trying to educate users about features and their benefits, motion becomes a really important part of telling that story and reflecting Google's brand. Cards also become another way of doing that. And Google News has cards, but they're really focused on stories. There's a limited selection of article types. Whereas Google Pay can get a lot richer with imagery and has a lot more diversity in functions that they need for cards. So you can see how the layouts start to reflect that. And that across a range of the card types we have, color and illustration now become front and center for showing the brand. It's not so much about the content or the AI smarts. It's really these elements that are carrying the brand forward and are played up in this application. So hopefully the examples of Google News and Google Pay show how even a single material design theme can be used by a variety of applications through careful consideration of color, of typography, of supporting elements like imagery and motion to really help each app tune the design for what they need and pick from the system, only the parts that make sense for them. But it's not just Google who's using material design and these new capabilities of material theming. As we were exploring these updates to our system, beyond doing our own internal testing and doing that testing across Google, we worked with a select set of partners in the community to test out new capabilities of material design and help them get started in applying it. Lyft, for example, which is a ride-sharing application in the United States, uses our extended fab component that you may remember from the Google Pay example that I shared just now, but does it in its own way. They're bringing in their brand colors, which are a big part of their brand identity, to help promote their key action in their app, which is booking a ride. NPR, which is a public radio application, uses our cards. They use more material design in their app to begin with, but started looking to express some more of their brand through things like shape. So they're using these rounded cards to really capture different sets of content, these collections that users can browse when deciding what to listen to next. Genius, which is a music lyric explanation site and news site, is using our responsive layout grid for help unifying their UI from desktop to mobile. This is one area we've invested a lot in to help users who are designing mobile first or desktop first really understand how they could bring their application across platforms. And Zappos, which is an e-commerce retailer that sells shoes, used the backdrop as part of their explorations for how to make their app more personal. If they move their navigation from the front layer of their app to the back layer, it could free up room for them to do more personalized offers and content for their users. So in review, I think material studies help show a range of possibilities for what you can do with material theming. They show how making bold choices for key decisions like shape, typography, layout, color can really help an app feel like your brand, even if it's using material design as its foundation. Google's material theme helps show how a single theme that you create using material design can support many products. A design system is about much more than the components. So even if those elements are the same, thinking about your principles as a brand outside of just the components becomes really important in helping individual apps within your ecosystem feel like their own and be able to serve users well. And lastly, companies are already adopting material design, material theming in their own products. And they don't have to do a full redesign to get started. The examples I just shared there focused on a key need, a single action or a single layout or a content type to serve as a starting point, an introduction into material design and material theming. For more updates, please check out our website at material.io. If you go to the design section, you'll see design guidelines for a lot of the components I talked about, the material studies, which offer a lot more in-depth information about how we use theming to express each of these brands and help these apps feel unique. And to keep up with updates for when we're launching new features, new components, new capabilities across both design and engineering, please follow us on Twitter at Material Design. So I'm very excited to see what you all do with these new capabilities. Once again, I'll be doing an office hour session right after this. So if you have questions, please come find me there if you want to take a look at your app. Otherwise, I'm happy to take some questions now as well. Thank you.